Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Great. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the fourth online session of the Grid-Scale Renewable Energy Community of Practice. This is Karishma speaking on behalf of the ALP and the Let's GP and the Energy Working Group. I'd like to introduce this topic very quickly. You can see the agenda on the next slide. We'll run through it briefly. Next slide, please. And then we'll let people join as they arrive, as they come. Just very quick housekeeping rules. Please, since when there's panelists and presenters speaking, you will be on mute. And then when this is very much we welcome discussion and participation. And so at that point, we will unmute everyone. But if you are not speaking, please mute yourself so that we can hear other people and there's no feedback. So like I was saying, this session came up as a priority topic. There was a lot of interest soon after ACEF, the Asia Clean Energy Forum, and then also from other feedback we've received from this group to learn more on the topic, and then also to specifically learn more about Sri Lanka's experience. And so we have the pleasure of having Mr. Randika Vijayakun with us from the Ceylon Electricity Board to provide some insight on their process and highlights of their results and some of their next steps that they've planned. So as you can see, Nikhil will do a quick overview of ACEF for those who were not able to attend. And then the next piece, we'll all introduce ourselves. So Nikhil will prompt all of us. You can see each other under the attendees tab if you're curious who else is on the line. Ilya Chernakovsky will sort of set the stage with some of the basics, best practices, and then Randika will take over. We'll have some time for open discussions, and then we'll quickly close the session and talk about some of the priority topics and next steps. So Nikhil, please.
Thanks, Karishma. Welcome to all of you. I'll get going. I see that some of the attendees have already, the participants have already joined at the Asia Clean Energy Forum. So we had a session, a detailed session on peer learning, on grid integration, where we had around 35 participants, 35 members who joined the session, and we had discussions between countries on what are the current, what's the current situation, what opportunities and challenges do they see for grid integration of RE, and what's the way forward. Members also participated in 2 deep dive workshops which are organized on grid integration by USAID at GIZ and NREL, where again various aspects of grid integration were covered, and there were also case studies and experiences, best practices shared from different countries, Asian as well as some from Germany and other countries in South America as well. Renewable energy auctions, again, similarly, best practices were shared and how to structure, how to design auctions so as to make it more effective. And again, experiences, practices from different perspectives were shared as well. And we, in ACEF, we had, this was a great outcome that we had 30 new members who joined this community of practice. So that was it was a good outcome, and we are pleased that we could really have 30 new members who can share their experiences and go on, move the activities that we're going to undertake forward. In terms of what happened in the peer learning session, so we had, we basically had this, this was a really interactive and interactive session where we had roundtable discussions, and it was a working session. We had split up our members into policy and technical groups, and they discussed on various aspects of what is working, what's not working, what is inhibiting grid integration, and we could then prioritize. Priority topics came up where there is more support needed, where knowledge exchange is needed. Also, possible steps that can be taken, priority steps and actions that also came up from the discussion specific to each country. And as you can see, it was again, we had good attendance and diversity in terms of the countries in the context that attended this session. Next slide, please. Yeah, so quickly in terms of the topics of interest that came up, the one that we are covering today, studies for grid integration and distribution, RE grid integration and distribution, that came up as a key topic. And again, countries who are just starting out, like Bangladesh, like Indonesia, Bhutan, in different contexts in terms of their geographies. Also, they were interested in knowing more from countries like Sri Lanka and also Thailand, who have done work on this. Grid codes came up as a key topic in terms of how regular updates are needed in terms of to keep up with increasing integration or increasing installed capacities of renewable energy in the grid. And also, importantly, enforcement of the grid codes came up as a key priority. Auctions for renewable energy also came up as an important need. So how to design and how to actually promote renewable energy integration and through competitive auction process, so that increasing installation is also efficient economically as well. And the last one, which was how to promote flexibility, basically how to use your existing conventional assets, that is conventional energy generation, how to utilize it along with the renewable energy capacity that's growing, so that you have more flexibility in the system overall, and then how to design incentives and how to promote this through economic incentives and financial compensation mechanisms. So this will, we are looking at the other, all these priority topics in our forthcoming activities as well. Karishma will go through that in her slides at the end. Next slide, please. Yeah. And we have already shared the outcome report, a summary of the session that happened at ASEF, and also a gist of the deep dive training workshops. And these are some of the resources as well, which can be used readily on different aspects of grid integration, RE auctions. So I'm not going to go in detail on this, but this can, anyway, the slides will be passed on after the session, and these are available for your use readily. Yeah, that's it from my side. So thank you. And now I think we move on to introductions. And just for your information, before we go on to that, the handouts, if you see on the panel at the bottom, you can see handouts about chat. So in handouts, we've already shared the slides that are going to be presented today. So you can download and see this while the session goes on. And for any questions or comments that you have, please type into the questions box, and we'll try to get these answered and addressed during the session. So I'll move on to the introductions. We'll go alphabetically as per the attendees list. So I request you to unmute yourself, and once you finish speaking, you can mute again. So if you can just give a quick brief introduction on your name, which country you come from, and the organization, and just a 1-2 line brief on what are you working on in relevance to this topic and to RE grid integration and activities. Yeah, so starting with Aditi Paul. Hello, Aditi. Yeah, maybe we'll come back later. Moving on to Mr. Huda.
Hi, good morning. This is Kamal Huda. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Kamal Huda. I am working in a private company by the name Energy Pack in Bangladesh. It is a power engineering company in Bangladesh, working in a different capacity, starting from substation manufacturing to EPC for power plants. In both fossil fuel and renewable energy. Although those are a bit conflicting, but still, I mean, we are trying to move slowly to the renewable energy sector in bigger scale. I'm working in this company as Deputy General Manager for the last 8 years. So thank you and nice meeting you all.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Huda, and nice meeting you again after ASF. Yeah, moving on to Fion Chen. Hello. Hello. Fion, please go on. We see you are unmuted.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Hello? This is Yang from Taiwan. And I work in Metal Industry Research and Development Center. And since you may know that Taiwan government will install 5.5 gigawatt offshore wind and 20 gigawatt solar power by 2025. And my task is provide the industrial policy suggestion to our government to build up local renewable energy supply chain. And today I am so glad to have a chance to join the webinar to learn more about the large-scale renewable energy grid integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving on to Xuan Yang. Hello, can you please unmute yourself? Okay, we'll move on. In case you're not able to speak, you can also type in your introduction in the chat option. Moving on to BJ. Yeah, BJ, please. Hello?
Hello.
Yes, go on.
Yes, my name is BJ Gochokov from Miclay, Southeast Asia. We're also part of the AOP Secretariat. We're not currently working on any RE grid related projects, but we're all working on the Building Efficiency Accelerator of the WRI and NRO. So that's related to that.
Yeah. Thank you, BJ. Yeah, moving on to Kate Chan. Hello, Kate. Hello, Kate. Can you speak, please? Yeah, we'll just cover Kung Chian. Yeah, Mr. Letwa. Hello.
Chào bạn, support huấn luyện nhà vệ sinh.
Hello. Yeah. Mevan, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Myung Gelsin, Director, Department of Renewable Energy in Bhutan. In Bhutan, my department has looked after rural electrification. So as of now, we talk about 100% electrification get to more than 99% on grid electricity. With renewable energy, mainly on the distributed renewable energy costs being coming down, we are now contemplating that if most of the consumers can become producers. So we are looking on some of the strategies, how we might actually look into the policy and regulatory regime to allow people to inject renewable energy into the grid. Unfortunately, in next 15 minutes time, I'm being asked to attend another meeting. That's very sorry part, but I hope I will be able to retrieve some of the discussions that this conference is taking up, and I'll see how I can deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Punsara.
Good morning, everybody. I am Punsara Nagasinghe from Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka. I'm an assistant director. Some of our commission staff members are also joining this discussion through the same link. Thanks.
Okay. Great to see you, Lord. Thank you. Satish, are you there? Okay, maybe Satish can type in. Mr. Heather. Tanawat, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Tanawat Kiripart from Thailand. I'm working at a USA Clean Power Asia program here, and our involvement in renewable energy is pretty much the whole entire program. Right now, I'm working with the Lao government to conduct the solar pilot auction, the first in Laos, as well as the RE grid integration regulations. So that's activity we're doing in Laos. We also have some activities in the Philippines where we are doing the DPV study, looking at the impact on the customer economics, utility rates and revenues, as well as technical aspect. Thank you, and hopefully this in the workshop, the webinar here will help me understand a bit more details and experience from everybody else also. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanawat. Hello. Yes.
I am Ping Lin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're logged in from two devices. Can you just use one? Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Industrial Development Bureau and Ministry of Economic Affairs, Republic of China. And we are working, I'm a technical specialist and support the sustainable development related issue. So very glad to attend this meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yulia? Hello, Yulia? Yvonne? Okay, maybe you can just type in your introduction because we are running a bit late. We'll just quickly run through our team. So starting with Karishma.
Thanks, Nikhil. My name is Karishma Gokhale Welch. I've met some of you at ASEF and at other workshops. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, and I also represent Let's GP and the Let's GP Energy Working Group. I work closely with the Asia-Let's partnership, and my work includes providing technical assistance to developing country governments, power sector transformation projects in Asia, and also microgrid projects in the US. And I co-lead this effort along with ALP. Thank you.
Thanks, Karishma. Ananda?
Hello, everyone. This is Anandan from Asia Leads Partnership. I am involved in managing thematic communities of practices in Asia region with support from Leads Global Partnership and its working groups. Also, I am involved primarily in delivering other ALP Secretariat services, which one of the main services is to promote low emission development strategies in the Asia region. And I'm very glad to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks. Ilya?
Yes, hi, my name is Ilya Chernikovsky, and I'm an energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. And it's a pleasure to meet you all, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Thanks. Randika, please go on.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Randika Vijayakovan. I'm an engineer from the Ceylon. It is the national utility of Sri Lanka. I'm working at the transmission and generation planning branch. And I think some of us have already met during the ASF about 2 months ago. I'm so glad to see you all again here in this session.
Thanks, Randika. Ritvik, if you could quickly. Hello, Ritvik.
Unmuted.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Ritvik. I represent the ALP Secretariat. I work with the Italy South Asia office.
Thanks.
Muted.
And finally, I'm Nikhil. I've met some of you at ASEF and also been in touch over emails. I work at the Asia Leads Partnership Secretariat. We looking at the activities for this community of practice and also chipping in where needed. Overall, I have specialization in energy and I'm working with cities and other entities in the region on energy and climate action plan and integration of renewable energy in different aspects. Thank you. So maybe now we move on to the first presentation by Ilya. Yeah, Ilya, you can show your screen. Go ahead, Ilya.
Yes, hi. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Ilya Chernikovsky and I work at NREL in Golden, Colorado. I'm a power systems modeler and energy analyst, and I'll be giving a brief overview of different types of grid integration studies. I'll talk a little bit about the organizing process and how to develop a grid integration study. And then we'll get into a little bit about the details of what kind of questions a grid integration study can answer. So let's start with some definitions. So what is a grid integration study? A grid integration study represents a comprehensive examination of the technical challenges and potential solutions that are associated with integrating large amounts of variable renewable energy, so wind and solar, to the bulk power system. And so we'll be talking about different types of assessments of renewable integration into the bulk power system. So some of the questions that we can answer using grid integration studies are written on this slide. So how much capacity do I need to reliably meet demand in the future? What are the operational impacts? What are the impacts on the traditional, conventional thermal fleet, on the coal, on the gas plants, on my hydro resources? What are the impacts on the transmission network? We can also answer optimization questions. So what is the least cost mix of capacity resources in the future? And what happens if some of our assumptions might change? So for example, if the price of gas goes up, or if more gas becomes available and it becomes cheaper, how do our results change? What are the impacts of different policies? So different renewable energy targets, different stringent or less stringent environmental regulations. Grid integration studies overall inform investors into the government's commitment into the development of the energy sector. So it's also an important source of information that a government can provide to potential local businesses and to foreign investment organizations as well. So I'll quickly discuss the different types of grid integration studies. But first, I'll review some of the enabling elements. So the first that we have here is to implement known effective solutions. And what do we mean by this? Well, there are certain low-hanging fruit or no-regrets investments that we know are beneficial for grid integration, and we know this without doing a grid integration study. So for example, forecasting of renewable energy generation. This is a no-regrets investment, and it's a relatively easy decision for a system operator to take without doing a comprehensive grid integration study. So data collection and modeling expertise, those are the enabling fundamental building blocks that are necessary in order to produce a high-quality grid integration study. Now here we have the different type of analysis that can be conducted within a grid integration study. They're capacity expansion modeling, production cost modeling, and power flow studies. And we'll talk about each of these in some detail later in the presentation, but here I'd like to point out the fact that there is significant levels of iteration between these different types of analysis. So a capacity expansion study can provide the generation and transmission scenarios that are then analyzed in a production cost study. And the results of a production cost study can inform the periods of system stress that are then analyzed in a power flow study. In the other direction, there's also iteration. So a power flow study can provide different operational parameters that are then reevaluated in a production cost study, and those parameters may affect the capacity expansion modeling. And so this process is not static. It can be iterative, and it may take several studies in order to get to a result that is acceptable to all parties. And finally, the goal of our grid integration study analysis is to inform policies. And that's why stakeholder engagement from the public sector, from government, from regulators, from businesses and investment organizations, that engagement of stakeholders is important throughout each step in this process in order to inform evidence-based policymaking. So what are the different phases of a grid integration study? The first phase is data collection. The second phase is developing scenarios, and this is where the stakeholder engagement process becomes very important. The third phase is analysis, where the modeling team organizes data sets, develops the model, runs the model, analyzes results and makes any necessary adjustments. And through the process of stakeholder consultations, they arrive at results that are trustworthy and acceptable to all interested parties. And then finally, there's a phase of reporting, and this includes synthesizing results into a report that can be read by non-experts in order to inform policy. So who are the typical stakeholders in a grid integration study? They're data providers, they can be power system operators, utilities, renewable energy plant owners and owners of conventional power plants, transmission developers, regulators, policymakers, and then also public advocates and consumer groups. Throughout the different phases of the study, you may need to consult with different stakeholders. And one of the primary ways that we consult with stakeholders is through a technical review committee. So a technical review committee helps to ensure the accuracy of the assumptions. It helps to ensure the quality of data. And it is used as a way to ensure that the results of the study will be used in the decision-making process. So the members of a TRC, or a technical review committee, are not involved in the day-to-day modeling of a grid integration study, but they do provide direction to the modeling team. So their role might be to determine the study objectives, to review the methods of the modeling team, to interpret the modeling results where that may be appropriate, and to link the model outcomes, as I mentioned, to the decision-making process in developing regulations and policies. Below, I've linked to a resource of the proceedings of a technical review committee for a grid integration study that was conducted by the company PacifiCorp. They are a utility in the United States. So this memo may be helpful for structuring a technical review committee in your country. So the next phase that I'll talk about is the data collection phase. And there are many different types of data that can be useful for a grid integration study. But in general, there are several critical elements. The first are solar and wind resource data. Solar and wind resource data are the foundational data elements that are important for analyzing large penetrations of renewable energy in the future. And this process of collecting high quality solar and resource data can be the most time-consuming part of a grid integration study. So it's important to consider what kind of solar and resources are resource data are available in your country, and to initiate that data collection process early on. Other data elements include wind turbine and PV system capabilities and characteristics, both currently and in the future. The representation of hydro resources, so water availability for hydroelectric facilities. Thermal fleet characteristics, so these are all the technical characteristics of your coal plants and your gas plants. Additional categories of data, so that there's electricity demand, so historic electricity demand, and also forecasts of how much electricity demand your country will have in the future. Transmission data, this is the network topology, and depending on the type of study that you're conducting, you will need different levels of complexity in the transmission data. For certain types of questions, you may be okay with just having transmission capacity between regions, and that might be okay for a capacity expansion study to represent current and future transmission capacity. For other types of studies, like a power flow study, you may need to collect very detailed information about each substation, the parameters of lines, transformers, circuit breakers, and all of the network elements that make up the transmission system. It's also important to understand how the grid is operated. So what are the operating rules? How does the power system operator schedule and dispatch generation resources? Also, operational constraints. So, for example, fuel availability for coal and gas plants, and other reserve rules and market regulations. Also, the availability of demand response, both currently and in the future system that is being studied. So on this slide, I'm presenting an example of the type of data that would be needed for a grid integration study. So here we have in the purple line, or it may be pink on your screen, is the electricity demand in Texas for the month of April at an hourly timescale. This is data from 2008. And you can see the profile of load as it changes from day to day. In the blue line, you'll see wind. And this is the wind output of all of the wind plants on the Texas system in the same period. So it's important here to understand that the wind data and the electricity demand data are time synchronous, in that the observations are over the same time span and observed for the same time intervals. And this allows us to create what's called the net load curve, and that's the curve that you see in green. And net load is electricity demand where we subtract wind. And so this is the amount of electricity that must be provided by all our conventional resources on the system, including gas plants, hydro plants, coal plants, and interconnections with neighboring power systems. So in this example, we have time synchronous data, but for certain types of studies, you may not need time synchronous load and renewable energy generation data. For example, for a capacity expansion study, an hourly average would be sufficient. But again, it really just depends on the objective of the study and what we're trying to learn. And that's important to consider at the very earliest stages of data collection. The next phase of the study that I'll mention is the scenario and sensitivity development. So a scenario is a possible future power system that we can study. And a typical analysis has 3 or 4 scenarios, and they might vary by the total renewable energy target that we're evaluating, the ratio of wind and solar generation to meet that target, a mix of resources that are available, like storage and demand response, and different rates of demand growth. Those might inform the different scenarios that we're looking at. Sensitivities are generally alternative options for increasing flexibility on the power system. So that might be the ability of the system operator to adjust load or use demand response resources, changing the size of the balancing area. We may also apply sensitivity about fuel availability or fuel prices. And these sensitivities are applied to each scenario, and then the results are compared with the base case. Now let's talk a little bit about three different categories of grid integration studies. The first is capacity expansion planning. The second is production cost modeling. And the third is a power flow study. So a capacity expansion planning study addresses the question of where, when, how much, and what types of generation should be installed in order to meet a renewable energy target at least cost. And these studies are typically conducted for 15 to 30, sometimes 50 years into the future. And the results will give you the optimal capacity mix for generation and transmission investments for each year in that study period. A production cost model, on the other hand, addresses the question of the operating impacts and the costs associated with reaching a specific renewable energy target. So what are the impacts on the coal fleet? What are the impacts on hydro resources and how gas plants are operated? And what are the impacts on the transmission system? And these studies are conducted over the course of, for a time frame of a single year, for a certain year in the future when we anticipate to reach our renewable energy targets. A power flow study is a very detailed analysis that answers the question of how does a system respond when there is a disturbance. So here we're looking at a time frame of sub-seconds, so it could be milliseconds or microseconds even, to several minutes. And so we're looking at how the power system regulates frequency and voltage in the transmission system. We're also looking at questions of transient stability and dynamic stability as the penetration of inverter-based wind and solar resources increases on the system. So a capacity expansion study, to explain it another way, the objective is to identify the investments and retirement decisions that minimize the net present value of future investments. And the net present value is made up of both the capital costs of generation and transmission investments, as well as the operational costs. So fuel costs, costs of providing reserves in order to balance the system, any environmental costs, so that could be costs of pollution. And these investments are minimized subject to certain constraints that we identify for the future system. So a constraint, for example, could be a specific renewable energy target or an amount of renewable energy capacity that we know will be invested in the next 10 years. And again, the results will give you the capacity mix that is optimal for every year in the study horizon. So from year 1 to year 30. Some scenarios, some examples of scenarios that can be evaluated in a capacity expansion study could be achievement of nationally determined contributions, achievement of a renewable portfolio standard, implementation of a carbon policy or a carbon tax. Other assumptions that could inform sensitivities around those scenarios could be the cost of fuel in the future, the amount of load growth that your country will see, and this may affect load growth in different regions in a different way. The costs of technologies and the efficiency of technology that you may expect in the future. Here are some examples of how capacity expansion studies and long-term planning is used in certain Latin American countries. In general, the results of these studies are used to provide signals for investments in competitive markets in order to inform the investment community about what the government targets are and to provide information that these targets are achievable. They're used as a form of promoting public discussion with interested parties, and also to design policies. So they may inform a government renewable energy target or a pollution reduction target, for example. Another type of study that we talked about is production cost modeling. So the objective of the production cost model is to analyze the impacts of an increasing amount of renewable energy on the system and how it impacts conventional resources and the transmission grid, and what are the overall cost implications of operating the system with increased variability. Here on the right is an example of results from a grid integration study for Kazakhstan, where a production cost model was run for a full year in the year 2020, including 2,500 megawatts of renewable energy, of wind and solar. And here we see an example of results for a single day. On the left is the southern zone, and on the right is the northern zone of Kazakhstan, and you can see how different power system resources respond to the variability of both load and wind and solar. Here's an example of results from a renewable energy integration study in India. The study was conducted by NREL in close collaboration with POSOCO and the Central Planning Agency in India, CEA. So here I'll play this animation, and this will give you an idea of the kind of results that a production cost model can show. So here, in this scenario, we're evaluating the effects of reaching India's renewable energy targets. So that's 100 gigawatts of solar and 60 gigawatts of wind by the year 2020. And you can see as the sun comes up during the day, coal plants are reducing their output and hydro plants are ramping down. When the sun goes down at the end of the day, the coal plants are coming back up in order to meet peak demand. You can also see in the dark blue color the variability of wind throughout the day and how that wind is distributed in the different regions of India. And finally, power flow studies, as I mentioned, are used to ensure that the system will be stable. And these studies are conducted for time horizons of several seconds to several minutes. For certain types of questions, you may need to look at even sub-second operations in order to see how the system will respond to a frequency excursion and how voltage on the transmission system will be controlled after a contingency event. So for example, if a large generator shuts down or a transmission line goes out. So for example, in Ireland, which is an island system, the results of power flow studies have informed a hard constraint on the instantaneous penetration of inverter-based resources. And I believe that limitation right now is something on the order of 60%. But the power system operator in Ireland is performing these studies on a regular basis in order to update those results. Finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that there are many different models and tools that can be used to conduct a grid integration study. So on this slide, you'll see different types of models and the different timescales, which is on the x-axis, that these models evaluate, and the different spatial resolution that can be used, that these models can be used to analyze. So certain models are good for sub-second or seconds to minutes analysis. Other models are good for evaluating several years or decades. Certain models are good for assessing impacts for certain devices on a transmission feeder. Others are good for evaluating the impacts of renewable energy at the state level and the national level. And it's important to, at an early stage, identify which modeling tool is most appropriate to answer the questions that you're seeking to answer. The final phase of a grid integration study is reporting results. So examples of products that can come out of a study are technical reports, so presentations that summarize results, journal articles, and a single study can generate several journal articles, publishing of data sets, visualizations like the one that I showed you on a previous slide, and press releases from power system operators and government ministries. I should also mention that I haven't covered all of the types of studies that can be conducted. There are many different studies that are important, but the ones that I've talked about here are focused on evaluating increasing shares of renewable energy in the future. Other studies might be good for evaluating demand. So how will demand change in the future? Another study might be used to evaluate the capacity adequacy of all of the generation resources in the future. A different category of studies is used to evaluate distribution system planning and to understand how the distribution system can be planned to achieve certain electrification targets. And then we also haven't covered hybrid and off-grid system planning, which is outside of the scope of our discussion today. And here are some tips for conducting a study. And these are some lessons learned that we have over the years from doing these types of studies. So first, you definitely want to clearly define what it is that you want to learn from the study. What are the goals and objectives? As I mentioned before, it's important to identify at an early stage what tool needs to be used to answer those questions and what data needs to be collected. Transparency is a really good enabling factor to make sure that the results of the study will be trusted and used in the decision-making process. And then it's important that impartial peer review is conducted, also to raise the profile of the results and increase the likelihood that they will be used in a policymaker's decision-making. So that's it for my slides. Sorry if I took more time than was allotted, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thanks, Ilya. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, you can just type it in, and we will anyway have a discussion session later on. So moving on to Randika now. Yeah, Randika, you could please share your screen.
How about now, Nikhil?
Yes. We can see it.
Right. Hello, everyone again. I'm Randika Vijayagon, and I'm from the Ceylon Electricity Board. It is the national utility of Sri Lanka. I'm from the Transmission and Generation Planning branch. That is the branch where we conduct capacity expansion planning and renewable energy grid integration studies, as well as other power sector related studies. So what I'm going to share with you today is the grid integration study that we completed about a year and a half ago. And we are really happy to share this work with you, and hope that this will provide some useful insights on conducting integration studies. Before actually going into the study details, I will give you a quick brief on our country profile and the power system. Our country is located just below the Indian subcontinent and has a population of about 21 million. And currently our electrification level is almost 100% and has a peak demand of 2.5 gigawatts. And our system is not connected to any other neighboring system, so we have an isolated power system. We also have a fairly good mix of generation resources, both thermal and hydro, with an installed capacity of nearly 4 gigawatts. Now, if we look at the renewable energy contribution over the past years, major hydro or the large hydro has been the main contributor, and the contribution from other forms of renewable currently stand at nearly 10% energy share. And for the variable renewables, we have about 200 megawatt of solar installation at the moment, and about 108 megawatt of wind, which brings the total variable renewable capacity to 28 megawatt. If I now share with you the primary reason for initiating this integration study, our country had ambitious renewable energy development targets, also had a very good quality renewable energy resources. Therefore, as the utility, we encountered the common problem of how we can integrate, how much we can integrate, or how much of those resources we can integrate reliably and economically into the system. And as we try to understand this problem and investigate further into the problem, we came to know that we need to focus on the impact of renewable on system operation, system stability, the seasonality and variability of renewables, and also the economic implications and so on. Therefore, we have initiated this study to answer those questions. Now, our study has three fundamental system planning study components, as Leah also mentioned earlier. Firstly, the capacity expansion study that deals with the long-term electricity demand forecast and timing and sizing of generation capacities, economic and environmental analysis, and other policy-related analysis for long-term time frame. Secondly, the system operation study, which is the production cost modeling study that focuses on medium-term and shorter-term implications on power system operation. And thirdly, the power system stability and power flow study that basically investigates the steady state and dynamic behavior of the power system with the high penetration of renewable energy. Now, in order to conduct a study, we have combined these three fundamental studies in an integrated approach that I will explain in the next slide. The overall approach starts with the performance assessment of renewable energy resources. Then we define different renewable energy development cases, followed by the optimization of long-term planning scenarios. And once these scenarios are finalized, we then move on to the transmission network study or the power system stability study, as well as to the system operational study. And these two studies are conducted parallelly, but with some interaction in between. And if any of the technical constraints are violated during these two studies, we again go back to the second step, which is the renewable energy, which is the step where we define the renewable energy development cases. That iteration process is important, and that is also highlighted by Leah in the previous presentation. And we continue then along the process until we get the results and to do the analysis. Yeah, so this process is very data intensive, and having a very good database is very important for the successful completion of the study. Now, for the next part of the presentation, I will quickly take you through the important components of this methodology, and starting from the performance assessment of the renewable energy resources. Firstly, for the wind, we have very good wind resources in the country. And you can see in the slide the Sri Lanka's wind resource map. We have modeled 5 wind resource locations to represent the country. Actually, the site measurement data was available for those all 5 sites, and we have used the software tool named the System Advisory Model, made available by NREL, to obtain the time series data on power output of the wind power for all the 5 sites, and as well as the energy production, annual energy production for all the 5 sites. Then we have performed the same exercise for the solar resources by modeling 2 solar resource locations to represent the country. And then about major hydro. Major hydro was treated slightly differently. We have a very complex multi-purpose cascade hydro system. So there we look at the hydro energy potential for power generation from the hydro complex at different probable hydrological scenarios. And also we look at the available capacity at the different hydro conditions and then in different parts of the year as well. And for the mini hydro, the small hydro, we have used a relatively simple model, a sort of average model to represent the resource. Now, once the resources are modeled and then when we know their performance, then we move on to the next step, which is the step where we define renewable energy development scenarios and then the long-term planning scenarios. Now, these slides show 2 such projections or 2 cases where we try to develop a target amount of renewable energy capacities to maintain a certain energy share. You can see the cumulative capacity and the corresponding energy share for 20-year period. And once these cases are finalized, we then move on to the long-term planning scenarios, where we try to find the optimum expansion scenarios. In other words, different scenarios with different technology combinations to integrate a target amount of renewable energy capacities. Now, if we turn to the system operational study, coming from the long-term time frame, now we focus on medium-term time frame. First, there we look at the hydro, thermal, and renewable dispatch, and then their optimization from monthly to annual basis, We use operational simulation softwares for that. And then from medium term to, we focus on shorter term operation. We use the dispatch optimization software tools for that. The two figures in the top of the slide, you can see how the plants would be dispatched in a future year. And then the two figures at the bottom shows how the production of renewable energy sources, and importantly, you can see in the red color how the renewable energy production is curtailed due to the operational restrictions. Now we have obtained and analyzed this curtailment under different scenarios and different sensitivities from the operational study that will give useful insights. Let's now move on to the power system established study. So our transmission planning group have performed a special short-term frequency stability study, especially to analyze the impact of variable renewables. There we can visualize the dynamic behavior of the power system for 400 seconds duration. They have generated a special worst case RAM event from solar PV resources, then applied that to the system under different scenarios, under different solar penetration levels and different dispatch scenarios to investigate the behavior of the system stability. If we move on to the last component of the study, which is the economic cost analysis, there we compute the economic cost of long-term planning scenarios. The idea here is to identify the most technically and economically optimum scenario to integrate a target amount of renewable energy capacities. So with that methodology, we have made certain conclusions and recommendation to support this scaling up of renewable energy for the future, especially the establishment of forecasting systems, providing curtailment rights to the system operator, and also we have emphasized the importance of increasing the system flexibility or the power plant flexibility for the future, and so on. And next, this slide, I think this slide is the most important slide of the presentation. Well, this integration study has increased the annual capacity additions by nearly 4 times for the future, and that has significantly contributed towards our national obligation towards reducing CO2 emissions for the future. Actually, for our nationally determined contributions,
Hello? Randika, we are unable to hear you. Hello, Randika, we are unable to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Right from this point again, we have invested in a detailed production simulation model where we can look at the renewable energy curtailment requirement and also the impact on other baseload conventional power plants, their cycling behavior, and so on. Another aspect is assessing the operating reserve requirement for future renewable energy integration. We have conducted a separate study on determining regulating reserves for different VRA shares for the future. Another different aspect is as we are moving ahead with the aggressive solar development program, we are looking at the temporal and spatial variability characteristics of distributed solar PV applications and their impact and their aggregated impact on the overall system. Lastly, in addition to the 3 fundamental studies that we discussed earlier, we think that conducting a distribution system integration study to supplement our next study is an very important component. With that note, I end my presentation and thank you for listening in. And if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to take that now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Randika. Thank you, Ilya. We do have some questions coming in. If others want to talk, please feel free. I think at this point, your microphones have been unmuted, so you can always please self-mute, but if you'd like to talk, please go ahead, and otherwise just feel free to send questions in the chat. So one question we got was, how many months?
Sorry, Karishma?
Yes.
Just 1 minute. You can also raise your hand if you want to speak and have any questions.
Yes. Thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you.
So one question was, generally how long does it take to complete a grid integration study? I mean, both Ilya and Randika can probably answer. Maybe Ilya, you can go first, and then Randika, you can tell us how long the Sri Lanka, in your experience, how long it took.
Yeah, hi, this is Ilya. That's an excellent question. Thank you. So typically the longest part of a grid integration study is not the analysis. There's significant time that goes into organizing the stakeholders. So that's developing a committee of people that will review the grid integration process and generating buy-in from all of the different stakeholders that might be interested and that will have an impact on the results. So that's probably the most time-consuming part. And then the second is the data collection part. So gathering all of the data that is needed to conduct the analysis. And from our experience, I would plan for a minimum of 1 year if this is a full integration study that has 3 or 4 scenarios and is focused on one of the 3 types of grid integration studies that we talk about. So, for example, a production cost modeling study that has 3 or 4 scenarios, I would budget 1 year of time. And that year includes, so that year includes generating the report and publishing that report and also disseminating results.
Hi, I'm Randika. From our side, actually, as Elia also mentioned, that the most time-consuming part is the data collection and the modeling part. And as if you have a very good team, I think from our side, looking at a time frame of about 5 to 6 months, because all the time this kind of study come with an urgent requirement from in our context. So we usually allocate about 4 to 5 months for this kind of study. But if you have a longer time frame, the results will be more accurate, more precise, and study will be much more comprehensive.
Thank you, Randika. Well, so Anjan, would you like to ask your question? I'm happy to read it out too, but if you want to elaborate, you're welcome to do that. Well,
Hello?
so yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm Anjan from India. Yeah, there was a question like on the economic cost analysis. So has any such study done, and what are the typical costs? There are two costs, one at the generator level and other at the grid level. So
Yeah, sure. So I think I can answer part of your question. So to evaluate costs at the generator level and at the grid level, a production cost model would be appropriate. And these are operational costs. So if we're excluding fixed costs and we're saying that all of the generation exists, what is the cost of operating that generation? So what are the fuel costs? What are the maintenance costs? What are the costs for starting up and shutting down throughout the year? Those kinds of questions can be answered. And also, what are the total production costs of operating the grid? Another part of your question, I think, is the economic assessment. So I think there are different types of studies that can look at a benefit cost assessment. And I think some of those questions could also be answered in a capacity expansion study.
okay, actually, we are also doing similar studies. That is at the unit level, and we have done it for 2 units, and we are doing for some more units. And in every unit, costs are different. So you need to benchmark this cost, because when you do for an entire fleet, say countrywide, you need some benchmark figures on which you can again do the planning and other investment decisions. So is there any benchmark cost?
So I think that what you're referring to is a study that's informing investment decisions for the private sector. And there are other aspects that must be considered. So that's the cost of financing, interest rates, and those kinds of issues. So those kinds of investment decisions aren't covered in the type of production cost models that we're talking about.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for either Randika or Ilya? Or for anyone else, actually, for any of your other colleagues that are online? Well, so I have a quick question while others are starting. Randika, can you speak a little bit about the stakeholder engagement process and how that worked? And then also, do you have buy-in from the decision makers? Because you've conducted this, but to do any sort of policy, for it to have policy implications, then there needs to be a decision maker also that's involved. So can you speak a little bit to that process in your experience?
Yes, Karishma, that original intention of directly related to decision making process, that overall long-term has a wider stakeholder engagement from the different parties. So as a component of that, we are conducting this integration study. For that, actually, we have stakeholders such as ministries, sustainable energy authorities, and other key stakeholders to provide the data and inputs and along the process, and also the system operator, which is again the utility, and so on. And then once the study is finalized and we incorporate those results into the long-term planning process, that again subjected to the stakeholders review in the process, and that is how the process goes on in here.
Okay. Well, so can you say what you like what you plan to do next? I know you mentioned a transmission study at the transmission level, and I know you have plans to update these studies, right? So can you just, I think at ASEF, one of the topics that came up was, and I think you mentioned it, and you made that good point about how we need constant updating of these studies. So can you speak a little bit more about some of those next steps or some of the ideas you have, or maybe even some of the challenges in doing that?
Right. Sure, Karishma. Now, once we do one iteration of the study, then only we identify the next challenges and then the opportunities for to enhance the system for great to scaling up of renewable. Now, for the next study, we think we address the operational and then stability.
Randika, I'm afraid we've lost you again and we can't hear you. While we wait for Randika to come back online. Oh, maybe we're back.
I think I'm back.
Yes, we can hear you now. Well, I'm afraid we've lost Randika again.
Maybe we can just take the next question.
Sure. Also,
Can you hear me?
yep, we can hear you now. But we keep losing you. Oh.
And for the next study, we are also planning on addressing technologies and demand response as another integration measures. And once we complete the next study, we will share that some of those findings too.
Okay, thank you. Well, so we have a few minutes before we close. Just want to see
Another question.
Yes, go ahead, Nikhil.
Yeah. So this is from Yuan from East Asia. Relevant to the stakeholders question, I'd like to also know how to communicate with the stakeholders, especially if when there are some uncertainties on the future cost estimations. Did you get that, Ilya, Karishma?
Yes. So I guess
Sure,
this
yeah.
is...
So,
Yeah, go ahead, Ilya.
from my side, so the stakeholders that are involved in a grid integration study should be involved in making all of the assumptions, right? So any assumptions that are used should be approved and validated by the stakeholders. If there are uncertainties, then the stakeholders should be aware of those uncertainties and should have input into potential ways to mitigate those uncertainties or to understand what could be the impacts of those uncertainties on the results. And so the technical review committee that I mentioned is a really useful venue for having those kinds of discussions. So the modeling team will give presentations to the stakeholders that are involved to inform them about these kinds of assumptions, so cost uncertainty, like you mentioned, and then the stakeholders can provide their feedback.
Okay, thank you, Leah. Well, while we wait for others to ask questions, we're nearly out of time. So I'll just quickly, if we can have the next step slides back again. The idea we heard from other topics that came up that were of interest were renewable energy auctions, and we did have, we're in discussion with Tanawat's team and Clean Power Asia to potentially do a joint workshop, online session on that, I mean. And then there's a webinar on grid codes that's currently being developed with our USAID partners and Greening the Grid, which is tentatively scheduled for sometime in October. So following that, we'll have another closed session discussion on grid codes. And then another topic that came up was there's a lot of work being done in India also, and we're not entirely sure, but if these are on other topics, but if you have additional topics apart from the renewable energy auctions and grid codes, please do send us an email or type in your comments here. There are also plans to develop some case studies and some good practice analyses. And then, of course, there's opportunity to learn from each other. And we've mentioned the remote, no cost to you technical assistance that can be provided through Let's GP. So I just want to stop there. I want to thank all of you for attending and spending your time online with us. I want to thank Ilya and Randika especially for presenting and telling us a little bit more about their work. And thank you for listening to me. I have a bad cough, so I appreciate you putting up with my voice. If there are other questions, please feel free to continue emailing them to us. We will respond to them. Any last words from anyone? All right. Well, hearing silence.
Karishma, if you can,
yes.
The survey.
Yes. Go ahead, Nikhil. Why don't you mention it?
Yeah. So since no one has any thoughts to share immediately, we also have a survey at the end. So if you can please take some time, it's a simple, quick survey, and if you can fill in your responses, and we'll then get back to you over email subsequently. Thank you. So we'd appreciate if you can just quickly respond to the survey before you log out. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Right.